He didn't walk into the Verge to find a wife. He went to prove that nobody could love a man with empty pockets. Kester Vaudrin had 17 days to marry or lose the empire his father had died building, so he shaved his head, pulled on a dead man's coat, and disappeared into the worst ward in Kilvane, with no name, no money, and nothing at all to defend himself with. On the fourth night, in 19 degrees of frost, a stranger knelt down on the ice in front of him. What he found out about her 11 days later burned everything he owned to the ground. They opened the jeweler's after hours, because that was what you did for the Vaudrin name, and so the whole business took place in a bright glass room, with the shutters down and nobody breathing. 7 trays. Black velvet. A ring on every square. "This one photographs badly," Delphine Amory said, and moved on. Kester stood with his hands behind his back and watched her work. She was thorough. She held each stone to the lamp, turned it, set it down with a small click, and never once looked at the price cards, because people like Delphine were taught that looking was vulgar and knowing was mandatory. The room smelled of polish and cold metal. Behind him the jeweler stood motionless with his hands folded, the way men stood near Kester now. "Cushion cut," she decided. 5.5. Nothing colored. Colored looks like a second marriage. "Whatever you like. You keep saying that." She smiled, and it was a good smile, unhurried and warm, and it arrived a half-second after it should have. "It isn't as generous as you think, Kester. It just means I get to be the one who chose everything, so I'm the one who's blamed." That was clever. She was always clever. That was the trouble. Her father stood at the far end of the counter with his coat still on. Osric Amory had made his money in salvage and never lost the habit of pricing a room by what could be stripped out of it. He hadn't touched a tray. 17 days, said Kester's uncle from the leather bench by the door. "I can count, Thaddeus." "I don't believe you can, or there'd be a date on paper." Thaddeus Vaudrin was 72 and spoke like a shovel going into gravel. "Your father wrote the charter, I only enforce it. A Vaudrin holds the chair, if a Vaudrin holds a family. No wife by your 40th, and it goes to a council vote. And that council doesn't love you, nephew. They're frightened of you, and you make them rich. Both of those expire." "Then let's all eat faster," Kester said. Delphine laughed. Warm, low, exactly 1 beat late. By the door, Renner Kilbride's phone lit up against his leg. He glanced down, turned it face down without reading it, and went back to watching the street through the gap in the shutters. He'd been doing that for 20 minutes. Kester had known him since they were 9, lifting copper off the Pier 7 scrap line, and could not remember him ever ignoring a phone. "There," Delphine said, sliding a ring to the center of the velvet. "That one. It'll read from 20 rows back." She turned to him then, and put her hand flat on his sleeve, and did the thing she had been building toward all evening. "Your mother would have liked it," she said. "Ilva, that was her name, wasn't it? Everyone says she was so proud of you." The jeweler's lamp hummed. Osric shifted his weight. Nothing in the room changed at all, except that Kester Vaudrin stopped being present in it. Ilva Sorrel had not spoken to her son in the last 6 years of her life. She had opened her door to him twice, and both times she looked at his shoes, his car, his hands, and closed it again, gently, without anger, which was worse. She sent the money back every month for 6 years. Same envelope, same 3 words on the back. She died in a rented flat above a fish shop on Pier 7, with a broken radiator and $400 in a jar. Proud of you. Somebody had typed that on a page. Somebody had put that page in a folder, and Delphine Amory had read it the way you read a brief before a meeting, and tonight she had recited it back to him with her hand on his arm and her eyes exactly where they should be. He looked at her, the excellent smile, the half-beat delay, and felt the room go cold and simple, the way rooms did before he did something people talked about for years. "She would have," he said. "Take it." Outside, Sleet came off the lake in long gray sheets. He sat in the car a while without telling Renner to drive. "She's perfect," Renner said at last. "I know." Kester watched a man across the road pull a hood up over a face nobody would look at twice. "That's the problem." Renner waited. He had always been better at waiting than asking. "How many people in this city would know my face?" Kester said. "Without the car? Without the coat? Without the name in front of it?" Renner thought about it seriously, which was one of the reasons he'd lasted 30 years. "None," he said. "Who'd say it out loud?" Kester nodded slowly and kept watching the man in the hood until he was gone. "That'll do," he said. The annex garage was 2 degrees above freezing at 4 in the morning, and Bram Toller had been arguing for a quarter of an hour without raising his voice once. "You'll be dead inside a week. I've stood in worse rooms than the Verge." "You've stood in worse rooms with a weapon on you and 6 men in the corridor." Toller was 65 and shaped like a mooring post. He had driven Kester's father before Kester could hold a license, and he was the last man alive permitted to speak this way. He spent the privilege carefully, which was why it landed. There's no ward in Kilvane where somebody doesn't owe you or hate you. Most of them manage both. Nobody looks at a beggar. Everybody looks. Nobody sees. They're not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly where a man gets killed. Kester was already stripping. The strip light caught the scar under his ribs from the halberd business, and the newer one high on his shoulder that still had a name attached, one he no longer said aloud. He lifted the coat off the workbench. Canvas. Brown once, gray now. Stiff down the left side, where a man had bled into it 4 winters ago, and the cold had set the stain like varnish. It belonged to Daniil Prosk, who died on a Tuesday because of a decision Kester made on a Monday. It had sat in a crate in the annex ever since. Throwing it out had never once felt available to him. He put it on. It fit, which he did not enjoy. 14 days, he said. "That's the whole of it." 14 days of what? Toller's voice finally climbed. "What are you buying?" Here is what Kester Vaudrin believed, standing in that garage, and he believed it completely, the way only a man who has never been hungry can. Money manufactures kindness. Remove the money and you see the material underneath. Every warm word he had received in 20 years had arrived stapled to a ledger. Delphine laughed a half-beat late and knew his mother from a file. His counsel priced its affection quarterly. He owned a house with 9 bedrooms and could not name one person inside it who would stay if the money stopped. So he would remove it. All of it. Strip down to nothing, no name, no protection, nothing to trade, and stand in the coldest ward in Kilvane to find out whether one human being would be decent to a man who could do nothing for them in return. If nobody was, he would marry Delphine Amory in Aldermore Cathedral and never wonder about it again. He was 39, and it did not cross his mind, not once, that there was anything grotesque about a rich man renting 2 weeks of other people's suffering to settle a private argument with himself. That thought would arrive later. It would arrive while he was on his knees. "Rules," he said. "No phone. No money, except what I can get with my hands out. No weapon. If I'm recognized, I walk out and it's finished. Pay phone at Kessing and 3rd, every 3rd night, 11 o'clock. I ring the annex line. I say harbor, you put the receiver down. That's the entire conversation. And when you don't ring? Then you come for me." "With what?" Toller spread his hands. "I won't know what street you're on." "No," Kester agreed. "You won't." Toller shut his eyes briefly, the expression of a man who has decided to stand and watch something he cannot prevent. Kester emptied his pockets onto the steel bench. Phone, wallet. The flat black pistol he'd carried 11 years, whose weight his body had stopped noticing and would notice violently in about 6 hours. Last, he worked his father's signet off his little finger. It stuck at the knuckle. It always stuck at the knuckle. He set it down, and it made a small, final sound on the steel. If anyone asks, I'm at the Ostend house until the 26th. Thaddeus runs the day-to-day. Renner keeps the wards quiet. And who knows the truth of it? You, Renner, me. 3 people. That was the entire circle, and the number is worth stopping on, because afterward, after the clearance on Morn Street, after the scrap line at Pier 7, after what happened on the ice outside St. Cyprian's, Kester Vaudrin would go over it in the dark, the way a man goes over a wound with his fingertips, pressing to find where it opens. 3 people knew where he was going. One of them talked. Toller drove him to the top of Morn Street and stopped where the working streetlights gave out. Neither of them said anything as good as goodbye. Kester stepped out into the wind, coming flat off the lake, and the cold went through the dead man's coat in under 4 seconds and straight into the bone, personal as a slap. He pushed his hands into the pockets and walked down into the dark. What he had not accounted for was the speed. Not the cold. He'd expected the cold, and it was at least an enemy he had come prepared to meet. What took him apart in 30 hours was how fast a city that had spent 15 years fearing Kester Vaudrin stopped being able to see him. On the first morning, a woman passed him twice outside the coffee place on Palfrey Street. He had sat across a table from her in September and signed off her husband's haulage tonnage. Both times she moved her bag to the far shoulder without looking up. Nobody read his face. They read the coat, and the coat answered every question. He had assumed the hard part would be contempt. It took half a day to learn that contempt is a luxury. It requires attention, and attention was the one thing in Kilvane he could no longer afford. At noon on the second day he tried to put his hand out. He could not do it. He stood outside the chemist on Kessing, with his heart going like a man on a ledge, and could not make his arm move. 20 years of ordering other men's deaths, and he could not lift a hand for a coin. When he managed it, the first to stop was a boy of about 11, who dug a fistful of shrapnel out of his pocket and dropped it in without slowing, the way you'd feed a machine. 40 cents. Kester turned and faced the wall. By that afternoon his hands were shaking for reasons the wind could not explain, and he was doing careful arithmetic about whether 90 cents went further as tea, which was hot, or bread, which was food, because it would not be both. He worked that sum for 11 minutes. He had moved $900,000 of freight in a single October afternoon, without thinking half as hard. At 6 he joined the queue at St. Cyprian's, because everyone said the church put out 40 beds when the temperature went under, and it had been under a week. He stood in it 2 hours in wet shoes. At the door, a tired young man with a clipboard asked for identification. I don't have any. A name then, any name, it's for the sheet. And Kester Vaudrin, who had never once had to decide what to call himself, opened his mouth and heard it come out. Sorrel. The young man wrote it down, looked at his list, and his face performed the small regret of a decision already made. We're at 40, Sorrel. Try the Wexcombe mission, they sometimes. Wexcombe burnt in November, said a voice behind him. The man behind him was somewhere between 60 and 80, white beard gone yellow at the mouth. He looked at Kester longer than anyone had in 2 days, with an expression Kester liked very little. I know you, the old man said. Everything in Kester's body went quiet. That's a dock walk. Heels first, like the ground owes you. He put out a hand with 2 fingers taped together. Odrin Pike. Everyone says Deacon, on account of I was one, once, for about 9 months. Kester made himself breathe. Sorrel. Course you are. Deacon smiled with most of his teeth missing. There's a vent behind the laundry on Bagsley, blows warm till 4. It isn't 40 beds, but it isn't the lake either. The third night the wind came in at -21. The laundry boiler failed at midnight, and Kester lay on a flattened box in a dead man's coat and understood with total clarity that he was going to die. Not eventually. Tonight, and in the morning, 2 men paid out of his own municipal contracts would come with a van and a bag. He shook until his jaw ached. Somewhere in the smallest hour he thought about his mother, not the flat above the fish shop, not the returned envelopes, but her hands, and how she used to warm his ears with her palms when he came in from the yard, and was appalled to find his face wet. He made it to morning. He never worked out how. The 4th night, he simply stopped. There was nothing dramatic in it. He sat down on the 3rd step of St. Cyprian's at about 8, because his legs had ended the argument without consulting him, and waited to find out what happened next, which is a thing a man can only do when there is nothing left to do instead. The half-hour rang, feet went past, 6 pairs, 10, nobody looked. Then a pair of boots stopped in front of him and stayed. And on a night 19 degrees below freezing, on filthy gray ice, in front of a man who smelled like a wet dog and could give her nothing whatsoever in return, the owner of the boots got down on both knees. Hey, look at me. You can't stay here. People die on these steps. It's not a figure of speech. She pulled off her gloves. He watched her do it. He watched her bare her own hands to that air, and then she pushed them onto his, one at a time, working his fingers in like she was dressing a child. There's hot food on Bagsley at 9. I go Tuesdays and Fridays. It isn't far and I'll walk you, but you have to stand up now, because I'm not strong enough to carry you, and I'm not leaving you here. He got his eyes as far as her face. She never asked him his name. And when she stood and put a hand under his arm and hauled, he saw that she was favoring her left leg badly, and that her own hands, bare now, had already gone white at the tips. "Same time tomorrow," she said, "if you're still stupid enough to be out in it." Her name was Vesna Dre, and she ran the line at the Bagsley kitchen like a woman diffusing something. He learned the name from somebody else. A man in the queue said it in passing. "Ask Vesna," the way you'd say ask the front desk. And Kester turned the 2 syllables over for a while, and found he resented that he'd had to get it second-hand. She was maybe 34, dark hair shoved up under a wool hat, a coat 2 sizes too big with the cuffs turned back twice, and a way of moving through a crowded room without ever quite touching anybody. She wasn't gentle. That was the first surprise. She was fast and blunt and slightly rude, and the room adored her for it. "Bowl, bread's at the end, take 2, don't take 4, next. Carol, if you come back through this line a 3rd time I will personally—" "Yes. Fine. Go on. You're bleeding. Sit down. No, sit down." Kester ate standing up against the wall, holding the bowl in both hands for the heat, and watched her the way he had once watched rivals across a table, looking for the tell, the angle, the thing being extracted. There is always a thing being extracted. He had built a life on that principle. He couldn't find it. That bothered him more than the cold had. She got to him near the end of the service, wiping her hands on a cloth over her shoulder. "You came in," she said. "Good. Your fingers were gray the other night. That's a whole different problem starting. You gave me your gloves." "I did." "You didn't get them back." "No," she agreed. "That's how giving works. It's an unusual system. It takes people a while." She nodded at the bowl. "Eat the bread. You'll leave it because you're being polite, and then you'll be hungry at 2 in the morning, and 2 in the morning is a bad time to have opinions." He ate the bread. "Sorrel," he said. She looked up. You didn't ask. My name. You'd have said it if you wanted me to have it." She pushed a stack of trays along the counter with her hip. "Half the men in here are hiding from something. Some of them are hiding from something that would put me in a bad position to know about. So I don't ask, and then nobody has to lie to me, and everybody eats." Nobody had spoken to Kester Vaudrin like that in 15 years, like a man of no particular consequence, whose name was his own business, and he stood there with a piece of bread in his hand, and had to look at the floor. "Rules," she said, because she had already moved on. Don't sleep east of morn. The boys under the flyover don't share, and one of them has a knife he's proud of. Don't drink the water at the standpipe on Kessing. Whatever Deacon tells you. And don't be on this street Friday nights after 9. Why not Fridays? She was folding a cloth. She kept folding it. Exactly as neatly. Exactly as fast. Collections, she said. Collections of what? Sorrel. She looked up, and there was something in her face he could not read and did not like. You're new. Being new is survivable. Being new and curious is not. Fridays, you're somewhere else, that's the rule. Behind her, on the counter, an envelope sat under a mug. Brown, no name on it, thick at one end with coins. Later, when the room had emptied and Deacon was scraping the pans, Kester carried the crates of empties out to the alley, without being asked, because his hands wanted something to do that wasn't shaking. Deacon came out with the last one and set it down on top of his. You're doing that wrong, the old man said. Not the crates. Her. I'm not doing anything. You're looking at her like she's a lock. Deacon lit half a cigarette he'd clearly been saving. Everybody in the Verge leans on that woman. She's got 400 people convinced she's fine, and the trick of it is, she is fine. Right up until she isn't, and then she'll go quietly, and none of us will know for a fortnight. Why does she limp? Ask her, if you fancy losing a hand. Deacon exhaled. Been about 8 months. She won't say, and I've stopped asking. Some things down here you don't get told. You get shown, eventually, by accident, and then you wish you hadn't been shown. Inside, through the wet window, Kester watched her count the coins out of the brown envelope into stacks on the steel counter. She counted them twice. Then she stood with both hands flat on the steel, and her head down for a long moment, in the way people do when they think nobody is in the room. Then she swept the stacks back into the envelope, put her hat on, and turned the lights off. She was short. He didn't know for what, or by how much, but he had spent 20 years watching men count money, and he knew what a man's shoulders did when the number didn't reach. He told himself he stayed for the intelligence, that a man who has just learned his own ward has collections he never authorized should stay and find out who is collecting. It was even true. It simply wasn't the reason, and Kester Vaudrin had built a career on knowing that difference, and chose, for the first time in his life, not to look. He made himself useful. He carried. He stacked. On the 6th day, the boiler died, and he stood in the back with his sleeves up and his hands full of a 30-year-old pilot assembly, because his father had put him in the Pier 7 engine sheds at 14 to humiliate him, and the humiliation had come with a skill attached. Vesna leaned in the doorway with her arms folded, watching him bleed the line. You've done that before. Once or twice. Where? Ships. She didn't believe him. He could see her decide not to care, which was its own kind of gift. There's tea. Don't touch mine. It's the mug with the crack. I have a system. She had a system for everything. Bread at the end, so nobody could see how little was left. Bowls filled from the bottom of the pot for the ones who'd been out longest, because the bottom is thicker. The tall stool by the door for Deacon, always, whether Deacon came or not. And she was funny. Dry, throwaway, assuming you'd keep up. On the 7th evening, she said something about the parish priest and a fire extinguisher, and Kester heard himself laugh out loud, and stopped, startled by the noise. He could not remember the last time he had laughed at something before deciding whether he ought to. That was the night he began lying to himself in earnest. He had made the calls. 3rd night and 6th, standing in a box that stank of stale smoke with his breath fogging the glass. Both times Bram Toller picked up on the first ring. Both times Kester held the receiver, thought about saying "come and get me," said "harbor" instead, and put it down. 14 days, he'd told Toller. He had 8 left, and a marriage waiting at the far end of them. He stopped counting. The unsettling thing happened on day 8, and it took him a further 2 days to admit that it had. A car came up Bagsley at 6:15, black saloon, newish, moving too slowly for the road. Kester was in the alley with the crates, and through the doorway he saw Vesna's back go straight in a way that had nothing to do with posture. She put the mug down, walked out front, and stood on the pavement with her hands in her pockets and her chin up until the car had gone past and round the corner. Then she came back in, picked the mug up, and carried on as though the last 90 seconds hadn't happened. Nobody said anything about it. That was the part that stayed with him. 40 people had watched a woman stand between them and a car, and all of them found something else to look at. The way you do when someone is doing a thing on your behalf that you've agreed not to mention. "Who was that?" he said. "Nobody." "Vesna." "His name's Ivo Slade," she said, wiping the counter that was already clean. "And you're going to be somewhere else on Friday. We've had this conversation." The name meant nothing to him. That was the first wrong note. Kester knew every man who took money in this city, street by street, ward by ward. Not pride, accounting, and there was no Ivo Slade on any sheet he had ever signed. The second wrong note came an hour later, when he was breaking down a box for the stove and found the brown envelope in the bin, empty, split open along one edge. There was a mark stamped in the corner in dull blue ink. 2 crossed anchors over a bar. Kester stood in a freezing back room, holding a torn envelope, and looked at his own family's mark, his grandfather's mark, the one that went on nothing anymore because it hadn't been used for legitimate paper in 40 years, and felt the floor of the world shift about an inch to the left. He put it in his pocket and told himself there were 900 explanations. There were not, and he knew it even as he thought it. The third thing was smaller, and it was the one that actually kept him awake. Every night, at about 20 to 10, Vesna Dre left. She did the same thing each time, filled a plastic container from the pot, not the top, the bottom, the thick part, put a second bread roll in her coat pocket, said goodnight to whoever was nearest, and went out the side door into the dark. 2 portions. She only ever ate one, standing up, at 8:30. On the 11th night, Kester Vaudrin, who had come down here to run an experiment on the human race, and who by now had entirely stopped pretending that was what he was doing, waited 4 minutes, and then followed her. She went east, past Morn, which was her own rule broken, down a street with no working lights, to the black end of it, where a 4-story building stood with steel plates over the ground floor windows and a demolition notice zip-tied to the railings. She looked both ways. Not the way you do at a road, the way you do when you have something to lose. Then she pulled a plate aside and went in. He gave her 90 seconds, and then he went in after her. The steel plate swung on one bolt. Behind it was a doorway, and behind the doorway was what had been the lobby of an apartment block, and Kester stood in the dark of it with his heart going and understood, in stages, what he was looking at. Somebody had been keeping this building alive. A camping stove on a paving slab, with a fire blanket folded square beside it, the way you fold a thing when you have thought hard about the day it will be needed. 4 mattresses along the wall under a window, boarded with 2 layers of ply, and a plastic sheet over them, and the sheet was dry, which meant somebody checked it. A bucket of grit by the door for the step outside. A paper chart taped to the wall at eye height. 14 names in 3 columns, a date beside each, a small blue tick beside some of the dates. He read it twice before he understood he was looking at a rota for who slept where. 14 people who could not go to St. Cyprian's, and Kester, who had run this city for 11 years and could tell you the tonnage of every hull that came through Pier 7, had not known there was such a category of person in Kilvane. Then he saw the coat. It was hanging on a nail by the stairs, a child's parka, red, with a reflective strip on the sleeve, and a hood lined in fake gray fur, and it was so small, and so carefully hung, that Kester Vaudrin put his hand flat against the wall. There was a boiler cupboard beside the stairs, standing open. Somebody had taken the front off the unit and laid the parts out on newspaper in the order they'd come off, spaced, aligned, oldest hands to newest. He crouched. The pilot assembly was a 1990s Renshaw, the same family as the one at the kitchen, and it had been cleaned recently by somebody who had no idea what they were doing and had been extremely careful about it anyway. Above him, on the second floor, a door closed. And then a voice, Vesna's voice, unmistakable and not remotely the voice she used downstairs in the Verge, said something he couldn't make out, and laughed at whatever came back, and then began, very quietly and very badly, to sing. She could not sing at all. She was wildly, comically flat, and she was doing it anyway, to somebody, in a condemned building, at 10 o'clock at night, with a container of soup she had ladled from the thick part of the pot. Kester backed out into the street. He put the steel plate back exactly as he'd found it, because leaving it wrong would tell her someone had been there, and he stood in the freezing dark with his hands shaking, and it had nothing whatever to do with the cold. She has nothing, he thought. She has no coat that isn't that coat. She goes short on the count, and she is running a shelter out of a building somebody is going to knock down. And under that, arriving slower, the thought he could not get rid of afterward. And there is a child. She had known he was there. The bottom bolt on that plate squealed unless you lifted while you pulled, and everyone who used the building knew to lift. The man following her had not lifted. Vesna sat on the edge of the mattress with the empty container in her lap and listened to him leave. 12 seconds in the lobby, a long pause by the stairs, where the parka was, longer at the boiler cupboard than anywhere else, which was interesting, then out, and, she heard this and rated it, the sound of the plate being put back properly. Not police. Police don't tidy up after themselves. Not one of Slade's either. Slade's men didn't follow people. They arrived at the front and knocked once as a courtesy to nobody, which left the new one, who had hands like a mechanic and a walk like an argument, who had said ships in a way that meant something other than ships, who had nearly frozen on the church steps a week ago and now stacked her crates like a man working off a debt she hadn't set. Behind her, Emmerich said, "You stopped singing." "I'm resting the instrument." "You're listening." "I'm doing both. It's called being an adult." She put her hand on the back of his head for a moment. "Go to sleep." She sat in the dark a long time after he did, working the sum she had been working for a week, which was the only sum that mattered down here. What does this one want, and can I afford to give it to him? She still didn't have an answer. That was the trouble. She had started hoping the answer was nothing. On Friday he broke her rule. He was supposed to be somewhere else after 9. Instead, he was in the alley behind the Bagsley kitchen at 20 past, in the black gap between the wall and the dumpster, and he watched the whole thing from 30 feet away. They came at 50 in 2 cars. 6 men, unhurried, quiet, and Kester, who had been assessing crews since he was 19, read them in 4 seconds. Cheap, local, unblooded, carrying the confidence of men who have never once had anybody stand up. Ivo Slade got out of the second car and never took his hands out of his pockets. They worked the street first, the shop with the shutter, the taxi office, the barber who'd been shut since November and still paid for the privilege of a door nobody used. Fast, almost polite, nobody arguing. It had the terrible smoothness of a thing that has been happening every Friday for years. Then they came to the kitchen. Vesna was already outside on the step, in her coat, with the brown envelope in her hand. She'd been standing there since 25 past, between the door and the street, the same way she'd stood in front of that car, and behind her, through the wet glass, 40 people were being extremely careful to look at their bowls. Slade took the envelope. He didn't count it. He weighed it in his palm twice, the way you'd judge a fish. "Short." 60, Vesna said. "It'll be there next week." "That's not how a levy works, love. That's how a favor works. And I don't do those." Slade turned the envelope over. So I take 60 out of the pot. That's the bread money, is it? Come Monday, there's no bread. And that's you, not me. People should know that. Take my coat. There was a pause on that street that Kester Vaudrin will hear until the day he dies. It's a good coat, she said, in exactly the voice she used to tell a man his fingers were going gray. Worth more than 60. Good buttons, good lining. And I'm inside all day, and half these lads aren't, so of the two of us, I'm the one who can stand it. And she took it off. 19 below. She stood on that step in a thin jumper and held the coat out folded over her forearm like a waiter, and Slade looked at her for a second and a half with an expression that was mostly boredom, and took it. Next Friday, he said. Full. Next Friday, she agreed. Thank you. Thank you. Kester came off the wall. No plan, no weapon, no name, and moving anyway. And Vesna Dre, without turning her head more than an inch, found him in the dark of that alley and moved her chin, once, left to right. Number. He stopped. 6 men, 2 cars, 40 people inside who could be identified afterward by anybody who wanted to. She had done the arithmetic before he'd finished having the feeling, and she had done it for him, and she had spent a coat on it. The cars pulled out. The street exhaled. Inside, Vesna came back behind the counter, picked up the ladle and said, Right, who's still got room? And her hands shook so badly she had to put it down again and make a joke about the cold, and the room laughed the way a room laughs when it has agreed to. She served another 40 minutes in a jumper. Afterward, when it was down to the 2 of them and Deacon asleep on his stool, Kester said, Why don't you go to the police? Ah, she was scrubbing the pot. You are new. Then go to somebody bigger than him. There's always somebody bigger. Sorrel, she stopped scrubbing. Have a think about who you're suggesting. I don't know the names down here. No, she looked at him, and she was smiling, and it was the worst thing he had seen in 13 days. Then I'll tell you one, and after that you'll stop asking questions like a man who's never lived anywhere. Slade doesn't own this street. Slade couldn't own a dog. He collects. Every Friday for 4 years he's collected a winter levy off the verge, and out of every envelope he keeps a bit and the rest goes up, and it keeps going up. And at the top there's a family that's been in this city since before either of us. And if you knock on that door and say, Excuse me, the arrangement's unfair, she shrugged. They won't even be angry with you. That's what people don't understand. There's no anger in it. It's a line on a page, and you're the line. What family? She turned the tap off. Vaudrin, she said. The name landed in that room, and Kester Vaudrin stood absolutely still under it. Nobody's ever seen him. They say he's abroad half the year. She wrung the cloth and hung it on the rail, precisely, the way she did everything. My sister used to say the same about weather. You don't hate weather, you dress for it, and you don't build anything you can't afford to lose. She picked up the empty envelope and dropped it in the bin. Right, she said. That's me. Lock the side door when you go. The top bolt sticks. And she went out into the cold in a jumper, limping, to walk 20 minutes east to a condemned building where a 7-year-old child was waiting for her, and Kester stood alone in a steaming kitchen that smelled of bleach and onions and understood, completely, finally, in his whole body, that he was not the man who had come down here to find out whether people were good. He was the weather. He caught her at the corner of Morn. I'll walk you. You will not. Vesna, you followed me on Wednesday. She said it without slowing, without any heat, the way you'd mention a bill. You put the plate back straight. Nobody puts the plate back straight. So either you tell me the whole of it, here, in the cold, or you turn round or I don't see you at the kitchen again. And I'd mind that. I want you to know I'd mind it. He should have told her then. Everything that came afterward, the vote, the clearance, the thing on the scrap line at Pier 7, turned on the 11 seconds Kester Vaudrin stood on that corner deciding not to. I was worried about you, he said, which was true, and was therefore the most effective lie he ever told. She looked at him a long moment, then she started walking, and after 4 steps said, "Right. Then you'd better come and meet him. If you're going to be around, he'll want your name before I do." Him was 7 years old and sitting cross-legged on a mattress with the front off a torch. "This is Sorrel," Vesna said. "Sorrel, this is Emmerich. Emmerich is not supposed to be awake." "The spring's wrong," Emmerich said, without looking up. "That's not a greeting." "It is wrong, though." The boy held it up. He had his aunt's flat, unbothered delivery, and a lisp on the cess. Kester crouched, his knees cracked. "That's not the spring, that's the contact. It's furred. Have you got vinegar?" Emmerich looked at Vesna with absolute betrayal, as though she had been withholding vinegar from him for years. That was how Kester Vodrin came to be sitting on the floor of a condemned building at 11 at night, cleaning battery contacts with a saucer of vinegar, a 7-year-old breathing loudly beside him, while a woman with no coat watched from the doorway. Later, when Emmerich had gone down, she sat on the second stair with a mug, the cracked one, carried all the way from the kitchen, and told him the rest, because she had decided to, and Vesna Dre did not do things by halves. "He's my sister's. Ottilie's." She turned the mug in her hands. "You know the Wexcombe mission burnt in November." "I heard." "Ottie was on the 2nd floor. So was he." She said it evenly, and kept saying it evenly the whole way through, which is how you can always tell. "The stairs went first, so I went up the outside on the fire escape, and the fire escape was fine right up until the bit where it wasn't. I got him, I didn't get her." Deacon had said 8 months. Deacon was wrong about most things involving time. "That's the leg," she said. "It's not interesting. It's just slow." "And the boy?" "That's the interesting part." She drank. "I've no claim on him. I'm his aunt, which is worth nothing on a form. His father's inside another 7 weeks, and he's a man who put my sister in hospital twice, and he does have a claim, because he's on the certificate." She looked at the plastic sheeting, and the second anybody official finds a 7-year-old sleeping in a demolition, that's the end of it. They'll have him in a car in 20 minutes and I'll never get him back. And they'll be right, Sorrel. That's the thing. They'll be completely right. "So you pay Slade." "So I pay Slade." She smiled at the mug. 60 a week on top of the levy. To not mention the building. He thinks he's being clever. He's not clever. He's just the only man in the Verge with a reason to keep his mouth shut and a price for doing it. Kester sat on that floor with a saucer of vinegar going cold beside him. 4 years of a winter levy on the poorest ward in his city, and he had never seen a cent, because it had never touched a ledger he'd been shown. His grandfather's mark on the envelopes. Dead paper, ceremonial. A detail only somebody inside the family would think to use, because only they would know it still frightened people. Renner had run the Verge since the month Kester's father died. Renner, watching the street through the shutters. Renner, turning his phone face down. And Osric Amory, who bought and sold council votes and had never touched a tray. He stood up too fast. "I have to make a call." "At midnight?" "Yes." She didn't ask who to. She had a rule about that, and he had spent 13 days being grateful for it, and now it sat on him like a hand. "Sorrel." She said it as he reached the plate. "Whatever it is, come back." The payphone at Kessing and 3rd smelled of damp and old iron. He dialed the annex line with a coin he had begged for, and he watched his breath go up the glass. It rang once. "Hello, Kester." Renner Kilbride's voice, easy and warm, 30 years familiar, sitting in the chair by the annex phone that only Bram Toller ever sat in. Kester did not speak. He stood with the receiver against his ear, and the cold coming through the soles of his shoes. "Say the word," Renner said pleasantly. "Go on. Say harbor. Put it down, and we'll both carry on pretending. Or say something else, and we'll have a different sort of week." Silence. 13 days down there. You've lost weight. I hear you're good with a boiler. A pause, and the smile came down the line. I hear she gave Slade her coat. Kester's hand closed on the receiver, until the plastic complained. Bring her into it again, he said, and there won't be a week. There he is, said Renner Kilbride, delighted, and the line went dead. He didn't sleep. He walked. By 4 a.m, he had it laid out the way he'd once laid out shipping schedules, and every piece of it fitted, and every piece of it was worse than the piece before. 4 years of a levy nobody had authorized, a mark that only family used, a collector who appeared on no sheet, a fiancé briefed from a file, a council that would vote in 3 days, and Osric Amory, who did not buy jewelry and had no reason to stand in that showroom at 10 at night except to look at him. The marriage had never been a merger, it had been a delivery. At 6 he went and found Deacon. The old man was on a milk crate in the loading bay behind the laundry with a cup of something, watching the sky go gray, and when Kester came round the corner he looked up and said, without any surprise at all, "Morning, Mr. Vaudrin." Kester stopped dead. "Oh, sit down." Deacon shifted along the crate. "I've known since the second night. It's the walk. I told you it was the walk, and you thought I was a mad old man having a moment, which is fair, because I am, but not about that. You didn't say anything." "To who?" Deacon laughed until it turned into a cough. "I worked the Pier 7 line 31 years. I unloaded for your father. Your father was a piece of work of the first order, and he'd have had me off that dock for a joke. And here's his boy, 4 nights in, standing in a church queue with gray fingers because he's been begging wrong." He wiped his mouth. "So I thought, I'll wait. See which one he is. That's the only entertainment I've got left." And you carried her crates for a fortnight, and never once said your own name to get out of the cold." Deacon shrugged. "That's not nothing. That's not everything either. Depends what you do this week." Kester sat down on the crate. "Tell me about the levy." So Deacon told him. It had started 4 winters back, the same month they buried Kester's father. 10 a week, and everybody paid, because 10 was survivable, and the man who came round was polite about it. The polite man stopped after a year. Then Slade, who wasn't, and the number went to 25, then 40. The barber paying for a door nobody used. A man called Perrin, who missed March and whose stall was on fire by the Friday after, with nobody hurt, which was the message. 4 years, Kester said. 4 years. Deacon looked at him sideways. "You want to know the bit that'll keep you up? Nobody down here is angry with you. They don't think about you. Your weather." He drained the cup. "That's what your name is now, son. It's not a man. It's a season people try to get through." Kester sat with that. "There's a building on the east end of Morn," he said. "There is. Slade's going to clear it." "Sunday," Deacon said. "It's been going round since Wednesday." Demolition notice came good. Some company bought the freehold in November. Slade's got the job of getting it empty by Sunday night and he'll enjoy it, and the 14 people in there will be on the street by Monday, and one of them is 7. "Who bought the freehold?" Deacon looked at him with something almost like pity. "Now you're asking the right questions," he said. "About 4 days late." The rest of Saturday, Kester Vaudrin did the arithmetic of the trap he was standing in, and it was the cleanest he had ever seen. And he had built some good ones. He could end it in 10 minutes. 1 call from a landline, 1 sentence in his own voice. "This is Vaudrin, the verge is closed." And by Sunday morning, there would be no collections, no clearance, no Ivo Slade, and 14 people would sleep where they slept now. And the instant he said his name out loud on Morn Street, Vesna Dre would learn that the man who had eaten her bread and cleaned her boiler and taken her gloves on a church step was the top of the page every envelope went up to. He walked past the kitchen 4 times that afternoon without going in. The 5th time, she was on the step with a bin bag. in a donated coat 2 decades old and the wrong color. And she looked at him and said, "You've got a face on you." Long night. She held the bag while he lifted the other side. "Sunday. Can you be at the building at 6? He stopped. "They're coming to clear it," she said. "I'm going to be standing in the doorway when they do, and Deacon's going to be there, and I'd like one more, and I'm asking you because you're the only man I know who can't be bought and can't be frightened, and I don't know why, and I've decided to stop wondering." The bin bag hung between them in the freezing air. "I'll be there," said Kester Vaudrin. She found it on Saturday night, and she was not snooping, which mattered to her later. He'd left the coat over the back of the chair by the stove while he was up on the ladder resetting the flue, and it slid off, and she picked it up, and something went out of the pocket and onto the tiles with a small flat sound. A brown envelope, torn along one edge. Empty. Her handwriting was not on it, because she never wrote on them, but she knew that envelope, because she had carried 19 of them out of that kitchen and put them into the hand of a man who did not count them. And in the corner, in blue, 2 crossed anchors over a bar. Vesna stood holding it with the ladder creaking above her, and felt the floor of her life tilt. Because there were only 2 kinds of man who kept one of those. She went through it the way she went through everything. Fast, in order, no flinching. Item, he had turned up a fortnight ago, out of nowhere, in January, which is not a month people arrive in. Item, he had gone gray-fingered on the church steps, and that could not be faked, and she had watched enough men freeze to know it. Item, he had asked, twice, who the collections went up to. Item, he had never once asked her for anything. Not money, not a bed, not a favor. In 2 weeks, she could not name another person in her life of whom that was true, including herself. Item, he had put the plate back straight. Vesna. He was at the bottom of the ladder with his sleeves pushed up, and she was holding the envelope out in front of her, like a card in a game she hadn't agreed to play. What is this? She watched his face do something. She had spent 8 years reading men across a counter at midnight, and she had never seen a face do quite that. Not panic, nothing so useful. It was more like a man watching a door close a long way off. "I found it in your bin," he said. 2 weeks ago. I wanted to know what the mark was." "Why?" "Because I wanted to know who was doing this to you." "That's not an answer, that's a reason." She didn't move. "Are you one of theirs?" And Kester Vaudrin looked her in the face and said, "No." It was the 3rd worst thing he ever did. She stood there another second. Then she took the envelope out of his hand and put it in the stove, and closed the door on it, and said, "Right," and went back to wiping down, and he stood at the bottom of the ladder for a while, before he climbed it again. She believed him. That was what he could not put down afterward. Not the lie. He'd told 10,000 lies and slept fine. It was that she had looked at him and decided, and the deciding had visibly cost her something, and she'd paid it, and gone back to work. At 9:30 she filled the container from the bottom of the pot, put the 2nd roll in her pocket, and stopped at the door with her hat in her hand. Sorrel. Sunday. After. Whatever Sunday is. She turned the hat over. If it goes badly and they take the building, they'll be looking at me and asking about him, and I'll be no use to anybody for about a fortnight, so. She put a key on the counter. It was a shed key, a cheap one, with a loop of green garden wire through the hole instead of a ring. Bottom bolt on the plate. You lift while you pull, or it screams and wakes the whole street, she said. Grits by the door. Do the step, or someone goes over. There's a spare canister under the stairs. Don't let him do it. He thinks he can and he can't. She put the hat on. He likes the torch business. He'll talk about springs at you for an hour and it's all wrong, and you have to let him. Kester looked at the key on the steel. You don't know me, he said. It came out of him before he could stop it. No, Vesna agreed. I know what you do at 9:30 on a Tuesday when you think nobody's counting. That's more than most people give me to work with. And she went out into the wrong-colored coat, and Kester Vaudrin stood alone in a kitchen, holding a shed key on a loop of garden wire, and had never in his life owned anything he was less entitled to. They came at 6:10 on Sunday with a flatbed, a contractor's van, and 11 men, which told Kester everything about how frightened Ivo Slade was of 14 people with nowhere to go. Vesna stood in the doorway, the steel plate leaning against the railings behind her. Deacon sat on her left on the stool he had carried 11 blocks and refused all help with. Kester was on her right. Behind them, the 14 had lined themselves up without being asked. Somebody had got the parka onto the child, and Emmerich was holding the torch he'd fixed. "You've had notice," Slade said. "We've had a piece of paper cable tied to a railing," Vesna said. "That's not the same as somewhere to go." "Not my department, love." "No," she agreed. "That's the whole trouble with you, isn't it? Nothing ever is." Slade sighed and moved his hand, and 4 men started forward, and Kester Vaudrin heard himself speak in a voice he had not used in a fortnight. "Stop." It carried. He didn't raise it. He hadn't raised his voice since he was 26, because at some point men stop needing to, and every man on that street stopped as if a wire had gone tight. Slade looked at him properly for the first time, at the coat, at the beard, at the face above it, in the headlamps. Kester watched the recognition arrive in stages, the frown, the small backward movement of the head, then the color going out of the man's face from the jaw upward, like water leaving a bath. "Ivo, you've been collecting a winter levy on this ward for 4 years. You kept a piece and sent the rest up. You used my grandfather's mark because you were told to, and never once asked why a family that hasn't stamped a legitimate document in 40 years would want it on an envelope in the poorest street in Kilvane." He took 1 step forward. "You put a stall on fire in March. And you've been taking 60 a week off this woman to keep quiet about a child." "Mr. Vaudrin," Slade said, and it came out cracked, and the sound of that name in that street did something Kester felt on the back of his neck. Somebody in the line behind him said, "What?" "Go and find Renner Kilbride. Tell him the verge is closed to him and that I said it out loud on Morn Street in front of witnesses." He looked at the 11 men. "The rest of you have 4 minutes, and then I start remembering faces." They were gone in under 3. One of them, a boy of about 20 with a crowbar, put it down on the pavement very gently first, as though setting it down loudly might be held against him. The flatbed reversed the whole length of Morn Street rather than turn. Kester turned around. The 14 had come to the doorway. Deacon was still sitting, watching him with an expression that was not surprise, and Vesna Dre stood exactly where she had been, holding Emmerich against her hip, the way you hold a child when you have decided not to run. She was looking at him. He had spent 11 years learning to read what people did with their faces when they found out who he was. The fear, the recalculation, the sudden warmth. She did none of them. She just looked at him and kept looking, while it went through her. He watched her arrive at the gloves. He watched her arrive at the church steps. He watched her arrive at the bottom of the pot. "Say it again," she said. "Vesna." "Say the name again." "Kester Vaudrin." Nobody moved. Somewhere down the street a shutter came down. "How many days?" she said. 15. 15 days. She nodded slowly, as if confirming a delivery. "And on the 4th one, you were on the steps of St. Cyprian's, with your fingers going, and I knelt on the ice and gave you my gloves." "Yes." "Were you actually cold?" "Yes." "No." Her voice didn't rise. That was the terrible part. It never once rose. "You weren't. A man is only cold when there's nothing else. You had a phone box 11 minutes away, and a man on the end of it who'd have come with a car. You were never cold, Kester, you were visiting." Behind her, Emmerich said, "Vesna," and she said, "Not now, love. without taking her eyes off Kester's face, and that was the only time anything shook. "I fed you off the bottom," she said. "That's the thick part. That's what you give the ones who've been out longest. 12 nights, and every one of those nights there was a man in this queue who didn't get it, because you had it." Kester stood with his hands open at his sides. "I'm going to fix it," he said. "All of it. Tonight. The levy stops. The building's yours. Yes." She laughed. "Once. And there was nothing in it. Yes. You will. Because you can. That's not a kindness. That's a tap. You've had your hand on it the whole time." She set Emmerich down, reached into her pocket, and took out the shed key with the loop of green garden wire. "You came down here to find something out," she said. "That's it, isn't it? Some man's experiment. You wanted to know if there were any good ones left." He didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer. "Well?" Vesna Dre put the key into his hand and closed his fingers on it, the same way she had put her gloves on him on the 4th night, working each one in. "Did we pass?" Then she picked up the child and walked back into the building, and the 14 went in after her, and Deacon folded his stool and followed, and somebody put the steel plate across the doorway from the inside. Kester Vaudrin stood alone on Morn Street in a dead man's coat. For a fortnight nobody in the Verge had been able to see him. Now every one of them could, and not one would look. Bram Toller picked him up at the top of Morn at 8, and did not say a word for the first 4 miles, and then said, "You've lost about 9 kilos, and Kester said, "I know," and that was the entire conversation. The house was warm, that was the first thing. It was the exact same temperature it had always been, and it felt obscene, and Kester stood in his own hallway with the melt coming off his boots onto the tile and thought about a fire blanket folded square beside a camping stove. He did not shower first. He would think about that afterward, and be glad of it. He went straight into the long room, because Thaddeus had assembled them the moment Toller made the call. Thaddeus at the end of the table, Osric Amory at the window with his coat on as though the room were something he was passing through, and Delphine on the sofa with her ankles crossed, immaculate, reading something on her phone. She looked up and took in the beard, the coat, the state of him. To her credit, she didn't flinch. She set the phone face down and said, "Well?" "Sit down, all of you," Kester said. Osric didn't. Kester let it go, because in about 90 seconds it was going to stop mattering. "There's a levy running in the Verge," he said. 40 a week a door, 4 years, collected by a man called Ivo Slade, who reports to Renner Kilbride. It has never appeared in any ledger I've been shown. That money bought something. Osric, you're going to tell me what, or I'm going to work it out by Tuesday and be considerably less polite about it." The room was extremely quiet. "Council votes," Thaddeus said. Everyone looked at him. Kester's uncle was sitting with his hands folded on the table, and he looked, suddenly, every one of his 72 years. "I've suspected for 11 months, he said. "I couldn't prove it, and I didn't want to be wrong out loud. 9 of the 14 seats have had money through them, Amory paper, Kilbride hands." He turned his head to Osric. "And a wedding, so that when the vote came, it wouldn't look like a takeover. It would look like a family." Delphine said quietly, "Dad." Osric Amory looked at his daughter and said nothing whatsoever, and that was the moment the room understood that she hadn't known. Not the whole of it, anyway. Enough to have been given a file, not enough to have been told what it was for. Kester turned to her. "There isn't going to be a wedding." "No," Delphine agreed. She was very white. "No, I don't imagine there is. For what it's worth, this isn't about you. It's a little about me." She almost smiled. Then, because she was who she was, and because she had never in 6 weeks asked him for anything. Was it a woman? Kester thought about it honestly, which she deserved. "It was a coat," he said. She didn't ask him to explain. He always respected her for that. He gave the orders standing up, still in the coat, and Toller wrote them down because Kester's hands were not steady. The levy stopped that night. Not paused, stopped, and any man who took a cent in the verge after midnight was outside the family. Every envelope paid back, every door, every week, 4 winters, with the interest a bank would have charged, in cash, by hand, with an apology. The apology was not optional. Thaddeus put his pen down halfway through. Do you know what that number is? Roughly. It's the Ostend house, and both dredgers. Thaddeus looked up, and you'll be doing it in the same week the council votes on whether you're still the man who gets to decide. Unmarried. Kester, if you do this, you will hand 14 frightened men a reason to say you've lost your grip, and they will take the chair off you and give it to whoever's left standing. Yes. That's your answer? Yes? That's my answer. Osric Amory picked up his gloves from the side table and paused at the door. Kilbride always said you were sentimental, he said. I told him no man runs a port for 11 years on sentiment. He said wait until winter. He left. Delphine stopped in front of him on her way out. Up close she smelled expensive and looked exhausted. For the record, I'd have been good at it. The wife thing. I'd have run this house properly, never embarrassed you, and in about 9 years we'd have been quite fond of each other. She put her hand briefly on his sleeve, on the stiff patch where Daniil Prosk had bled into the canvas 4 winters ago. I hope she's decent to you. She won't be. For a while. No, Kester said. She won't. When they had all gone, Toller came back in with a glass of water and set it down and said, Renner's gone. Cleared his flat. Cars are still in the garage. Nobody's seen him since about 4 this afternoon. He'll come to me. You can't know that. I can, said Kester, and looked at the dark window. He'll want to say it to my face. He's waited 4 years to say it to my face. The call came at 1:20 in the morning, not to the annex line, but to the house, to the number that hadn't changed since Kester was a boy. Toller brought the handset in. Kester already knew. Pier 7, Renner said. The scrap line. Come alone or don't, it makes no odds, but you'll want to hear it, and I'd rather not shout. Kester drove himself. He wore the coat, and he took the flat black pistol off the workbench where it had been lying since the 4th of January. Toller stood in the garage doorway and said nothing about any of it. The scrap line had been dead 9 years. Cranes still up, rust down the legs of them. Cliffs of baled metal under sodium lamps. The lake slapping the pylons 20 feet below, and everywhere the smell of iron and cold water. The smell of being 11 years old with copper wire down your trousers and a friend keeping watch. Renner Kilbride was sitting on a bale, in a good overcoat, with his hands loose between his knees. You look terrible, he said. Who told you? That's what you want? Of all the questions? Renner laughed. You're so predictable. You were in Toller's chair. He's been with my family 40 years. If it was him, I need to know tonight. It wasn't Toller. Renner shook his head slowly, almost fond. Nobody told me, Kester. Nobody had to. Look at what you've got on. Kester went still. Prosk's coat, Renner said. You kept it. 4 years, in a crate, in the annex, where I do the inventory. He spread his hands. Then one Tuesday the crate's light. Your uncle says you're at Ostend. Toller's suddenly doing his own driving, and you don't touch a phone for 3 days. I didn't need an informant. I've known you since we were 9. You're a sentimental man, wearing his guilt, and sentiment's a map. Kester stood in the sodium light and felt the last piece go in. Nobody had talked. The circle had held. He had betrayed himself, 4 winters ago, by being unable to throw away a coat. 4 years, he said. Why? Ah, better question. Renner stood up. Do you remember what you gave me when your father died? A title. Ward Captain. You gave me the Verge, the one ward in this city with nothing in it. No freight, no port, no hotels, 8,000 people with holes in their shoes. You handed me that, called it a promotion, and went to Ostend for the summer. You never said, of course I never said, the first heat came into it. You don't say, not to you. You sit in that house being perfectly reasonable and perfectly fair, and in 30 years you have never once asked me what I wanted, because it never occurred to you that I might. I was the boy who kept watch. That's the job I've had since I was 9. So you taxed them. I monetized an asset. They're not an asset, they're a street. 40 a week, Renner shouted it, and the sound went out flat across the black water. 40 a week, nobody died, and it bought me 9 seats, and in 2 days those 9 seats were going to make me a man with a name instead of a man who carries yours. And you come out of that ward in a dead man's coat because some woman gave you soup. There it was. Kester had been waiting for it, and here it came, and it arrived exactly as he'd known it would. That's what this is. Renner's face twisted with the pure contempt of it. 4 years, and it turns on a woman who ladles beans in a shed on Bagsley Street. You've pulled your own house down. Ostend, the dredgers, the chair, 30 years, for a limping charity case handing bread to men who'll be dead by March. Kester Vaudrin looked at his oldest friend across 10 feet of frozen dock. On Friday, he said. She was 60 short, so she took off her coat in 19 below and gave it to Slade and said thank you. And then she went inside and served 40 people for another hour in a jumper, with her hands shaking, and made a joke about it so nobody would feel bad. And I have known you for 30 years, Kester said, and you have never once in your life done anything that cost you anything, for anybody. Renner Kilbride went for the gun in his overcoat. He had always been quick, quicker than Kester at 9 and at 19, up a fence, over a rail, out of a yard with the dogs coming, but Kester had spent a fortnight being cold and hungry and looked through, and had learned something in that ward about how long a second lasts. 2 shots, both Kester's. The noise went out over the water and came back off the containers, and then there was nothing but the lake against the pylons, and a man he had known since they were both small enough to fit through a gap in a fence, lying on the concrete of the place where they'd learned to steal. He crouched down and took his oldest friend's hand and held it while it went cold, because nobody else in the world was going to, and because sentiment, it turns out, is not the same thing as weakness. It is only expensive. Toller was waiting on the road above the dock, with the engine running and the heater on. He had followed at a distance for 11 miles. Of course he had. 40 years, Kester said. 41. I asked him if it was you. I know you did, said Bram Toller. You'd have been a fool not to. Get in the car, son. You're shaking. The money started arriving on the Wednesday. A man in a good coat came up Bagsley Street with a canvas bag and a list, knocked on every door including the barber's, and said a sentence he had clearly been made to learn. I'm here on behalf of the Vaudrin family to return money that was taken from you, and to apologize for taking it. Then he counted it into their hands, made them sign, and went next door. It took 4 days, the barber cried. Mrs. Ogun, who had paid 40 a week for 3 years out of a shop selling nothing but phone cases and single cigarettes, sat down on her own step and could not get up again for 10 minutes. Perrin got the value of his stall. The man came to the kitchen on the Friday, with an envelope holding 10 weeks of 60, plus the levy, plus interest. Vesna Dre said, No. Ma'am. I'm not being proud. I'm being clear. She kept wiping the counter. That money's got a name on it. If I take it, then he bought something, and I've decided he doesn't get to buy anything. Give it to the church. They've got 40 beds and they need 80. The man wrote it down and went away, and she stood a long time in the empty kitchen, with her palms braced on the counter and her eyes shut. She didn't sleep much that fortnight. Here is what she was actually frightened of, underneath all of it, and it was not Kester Vaudrin. Emmerich's father came out on the 9th of March. She had the date on a card in her coat. And there was now a caseworker involved, properly, on a file. Because 11 men and a flatbed had turned up on Morn Street on a Sunday, and somebody had rung somebody, and the word demolition and the word child had gone into the same sentence on a form. The hearing was set for the second week of February. She had no address, no claim, no lawyer, and a limp. What happened instead was this. On the Monday, a solicitor's office on Aldermore Row wrote to say her costs were met, in full, by a client who had instructed them that she was not to be told his name and was not to be advised in any way she hadn't asked for. She rang them and shouted. They were very sorry. The instructions stood. On the Tuesday, the freehold of the building on Morn Street moved out of a shell company into a charitable trust, 14 names on the tenancy schedule, a repair budget, and no Vaudrin anywhere on the paperwork. She checked twice, then had a solicitor check, and in the third week of January, a man visited the prison at Halberd Point and sat across a table from Emmeric's father, a thin, frightened man of 31, 3 weeks into getting clean, and did not threaten him, did not lean, did not so much as raise his voice. He simply told him what a contested hearing would cost, and what a residential program in Ostend would cost, and that both were already paid for either way, or that only one of them ended with the boy in a house with a garden, and a woman who sang to him badly. The relinquishment came back signed, on the 29th, voluntary, witnessed, legal all the way through, which mattered, because anything else would have been overturned by April, and Vesna would have been finished. She found out where the money for all of it had come from, about a month later, from Thaddeus Vaudrin of all people, who was rude to her for a solid 10 minutes, and then told her, in the tone of a man reporting a fire, the council had voted on the 20th. Kester had not married. He had lost the chair, the Ostend house, both dredgers and a great deal else, and he had put the last clean thing he owned through a sailor room in the first week of February. A cushion-cut ring, 5.5 carats, bought at 10 o'clock at night with the shutters down. And on the 6th of February, at 10 to 7 in the evening, in a queue that went round the block outside a shed on Bagsley Street, Vesna Dre looked up from the pot and saw 40 people back, in a brown canvas coat with a stain set into it like varnish, a bearded man with no protection and no name and nothing at all to trade. He had not come to the front. He had not sent word ahead, or waited outside, or done any of the dozen things a man in his position could have done. He had joined the end of the line and taken his hat off, and he was waiting his turn. It took him 50 minutes to reach the counter. Nobody in that queue let him past. She watched that too. When he finally stood in front of her, he didn't say anything. He held out the bowl, and his hands were steady, and he looked her in the face, which he had not managed to do on Morn Street. Vesna Dre filled the ladle. She filled it from the top. He came back the next night, and the night after that. She gave him the thin stuff off the top for 11 nights running, which everybody in that kitchen understood and nobody remarked on. On the 12th, because Vesna Dre had a sense of humor that was, at bottom, quite cruel, she gave him the bottom of the pot without comment, and Deacon laughed so hard from his stool he had to be thumped on the back. She still wasn't speaking to him. Serving a man is not speaking to him. He carried crates. He did the grit on the step at the building without once going inside, because he had not been asked in, and did not intend to ask. He rebuilt the Renshaw properly, with parts he paid for out of money he had earned, which by February was a true sentence about Kester Vaudrin. On the 14th night, Emmerich came out to the alley where he was breaking down boxes. "You're Sorrel," the boy said, "and you're also somebody else." "That's about right. Which one do I say?" Kester thought about it seriously, because the boy was owed a serious answer. "Whichever one you want," he said. "They're both me. One of them's just better at fixing torches." Emmerich considered this with the gravity of a magistrate. Then he sat down on an upturned crate and started talking about springs, at length, and every word of it was wrong, and Kester let him. Vesna watched from the doorway with a cloth over her shoulder for 4 minutes before she said anything. He'll keep you there an hour. I know. You told me. The night you gave me the key. Right. She stood there. Behind her the kitchen clattered. You gave the ring up. It wasn't doing anything. It was 5.5 carats, Kester. It was doing something. She folded her arms. Do you know what I've been stuck on for a month? It isn't the lie. I've been lied to by better men than you, and I've got a system for it. She looked down the black end of the alley. It's that you got in the queue, 50 minutes. In February, you could have walked to the front of that room and every person in it would have moved, and you know it, and you stood in the cold behind Carol and let him take 4 rolls. He always takes 4. He always takes 4, she agreed. I want to say something once, Kester said, and then I'll go back to the crates and not say it again unless you ask. I came down here to run a test on people who never agreed to be tested. I did it because I'd reached 39 without one person in my life who'd have stayed if the money stopped, and instead of asking why that was, I decided it was everybody else's fault and went shopping for proof. I know all this. I was there. I'm not finished. He set the box down. The levy was mine. Not Slade's, not Renner's. Mine. 4 years under my name in my city, and I never looked, because looking would have meant knowing, and I had 9 bedrooms and a jeweler who opened after hours. Your sister died in a mission that burned, because there was one mission for 8,000 people. That's not something I did, it's something I allowed, which as far as I'm concerned is the same size. Vesna didn't say anything. So I'm not asking to be forgiven, Kester said, because that's another tap, and I've had my hand on enough of them. I'm asking to stay and be useful, on your terms, as long as it's useful, and when it isn't, you say so, and I'll go, and the trust's got nothing to do with me, and it never will. The wind came down the alley. You'd do the boiler at the building, she said. Properly, not the bodge. Yes. You'd do it as Sorrel. Nobody in there needs to be frightened in their own kitchen. Yes. And you'd take direction from me. Constantly. In front of people. I've been taking direction from you since the 4th of January, said Kester Vaudrin. It's the only part of this I'm any good at. Vesna Dre looked at him a long moment, and then she did the thing he had been waiting a month for without knowing it. She laughed. Properly. Out loud. Not 1 half-beat late, not measured, not deployed. Just a laugh. In a freezing alley. At something that wasn't even that funny. Right, she said, wiping her eye. Get the crates in. You'll set. She went back inside. He picked up the box. Kester. He turned. She was in the doorway with the light behind her, and she took something out of her coat pocket and threw it, underarm, and he caught it against his chest. A pair of gloves, old, cheap, worn through at the right thumb, and mended, badly, in the wrong color thread, by somebody who had never learned to sew and had done it anyway. You never gave them back, she said. No, Kester said. That's how giving works. It's an unusual system. It takes people a while, said Vesna, and shut the door. Inside, on the counter by the urn, there was a mug with a crack in it. And beside it, for the first time, a second one, chipped, mismatched, and put out deliberately. If you got something out of Kester and Vesna's story, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. And tell me down in the comments, what was the exact moment you knew she'd never take his money? Was it the gloves on the church steps, the coat she handed to Slade in 19 Below, or the 50 minutes he stood in that queue in February? I read every single one. See you in the next story.